Hello everybody, I'm Peter Laws, the host of the Scary True Stories podcast, Frightful, and also the horror-themed church service podcast, Creepy Cove Community Church, which is like, Songs of Praise meets Stephen King. What? But today, on my YouTube channel, I want to talk to you and show you, more to the point, a fantastic book about Terence Fisher. This book is called Terence Fisher, Master of Gothic Cinema, and it's the authorized biography of an important and influential horror filmmaker. Now, we'll dive into the book in a moment, but before we do, just a word about the publisher. The book comes from FAB Press, who have been publishing on cult cinema since the early 1990s, and they really are an excellent publisher. Here are just a few of the FAB Press books in my possession. For example, they brought out the recent autobiography of Italian horror director Dario Argento, and I love this book. It gives great insight into his horror career, but his upbringing also, and some of the challenges of his life. It opens, for example, with a moment in an Italian hotel room in the winter of 1976, when his masterpiece Suspiria is just about to come out, and you'd think he'd be filled with excitement and hope for this new career, his burgeoning career, I should say. But his thoughts are on the darker side. I'll let you read the book to find out. But yes, it's a beautiful book with color illustrations and just really well put together. This is the hardback edition. I also really like the Frightfest Guides from FAB Press. For example, here is Werewolf Movies by Gavin Badley. It's a superb scamper through werewolf cinema. I reviewed that book on its own video on my channel. And this is Michael Gingold's Monster Movies, which again is fantastic. And these people, they just know their horror inside out, and they offer great cult movie insight, but they're talented writers too. So you laugh and you learn stuff, and you feel you know these films even better. And like many FAB Press books, these are bulging with full color illustrations, which I always enjoy. Another FAB Press book I'm a huge fan of is this one, Satanic Panic, Pop Culture Paranoia in the 1980s. Now, for someone like me who grew up at this sort of time, this book is a blast. It explores a time when heavy metal, Dungeons and Dragons, and even He-Man was seen as potential portals into the demonic. It's a collection of essays from multiple authors, lavishly illustrated, and it makes for amusing, nostalgic, and quite frankly, sometimes depressing reading. There's even a full chapter on one of my favorite Satan movies, Evil Speak, so that's really worth checking out. One of the first FAB Press books I ever owned was Book of the Dead by Jamie Russell. And this book is, there's a lot of books about zombie cinema, but this is a particularly good one because of the depth it goes into. When I was writing my own non-fiction book, The Frighteners, about why we love monsters, ghosts, death, and gore, I found this book to be a helpful resource when I was exploring zombies. Next, we have an absolute beauty of a book, which you could call a coffee table book, but I prefer to call it a coffee table in itself because it's heavy enough and large enough to work as one of those. Stephen Thrower is a brilliant film critic and writer and musician, as well as having a scarily in-depth knowledge of some truly obscure film releases. And he also writes with humor and sensitivity. And his book, Nightmare USA, is a great example of that. It's the untold story of the exploitation independence. And every review or segment of this book, this bulging book, is just got packed with detail and information, as well as some truly amazing illustrations. I think a sign of how good FAB Press is, it can be seen in the fact that I have a few books on my shelves in my office, and they hold many books on the shelf, but the bookshelf bulges at some point, and I have to shift certain books to another room, to the bedroom, or even, heaven forfend, the garage. But I can't think of a single FAB Press book that has ever left the prized place of my office shelf. Because they arrive, I read them, I put them on the shelf, and I know that I'll consult them over and over again. Such as the detail and the breadth of information. So yeah, if you haven't checked out FAB Press before, do visit them at fabpress.com. There's loads of good books to choose from over there, not just horror either, so check them out. Now this leads us to the latest FAB Press book that found its way to my office, and Terence Fisher's Master of Gothic Cinema. Now, Fisher really was a master of this sort of genre and is best known for iconic films that he directed for Hammer in the 1950s and 60s. Examples of being Curse of Frankenstein, I should say, Dracula, The Mummy, Curse of the Werewolf. I like Curse of the Werewolf a lot. But one of the revelations of this book is just how much Fisher did away from these more famous films. And I must admit that before reading this book, I tended to kind of just think of Terence Fisher in relation to these Hammer films. And the book does a thorough and important job, I think, of widening our appreciation for his talents and achievements. So we start with his upbringing and his family life, and then we see Fisher moving into his career in 1933 as the oldest clapper boy in the movie business. Old because he was 29 at the time. And from his early work as a film editor, working on productions like The Wicked Lady, we start to see him directing films, and the book starts explaining about some of his interests in horror coming through some of his earlier films, like Long at the Fair, 1950. But the book makes sure that Fisher is not only pushed into the horror category, because he was so adept at various story types and melodrama, science fiction, period pieces. So after learning about this multi-talented man in the first part of the book, there's a kind of thrill when we reach the Hammer stage of his career, because it's like we're kind of returning to where many of us started with Fisher in the horror world, but we're seeing him in a new light. We're seeing him in this rich and varied three-dimensional backstory light. So as you read, you get a kind of feeling of the remarkable achievement that these films were for him personally, and also, of course, the reputation of him and Hammer horror films. And this kind of demonstrates a career that may well have been defined by those horror moments, but it's not eclipsed by them. They all feel like a part of a natural ongoing story of his talented life. And make no mistake, in true FAB Press tradition, his life is told in great depth, with close to 504 or so pages of history, facts, stories, anecdotes, about 210,000 words. And you might think that sounds like overkill, but it's not, because firstly, the book is loaded with illustrations and photographs, many of which I've never seen before. There's about 490 illustrations, 48 pages that are in full color, so it's like sumptuous. But secondly, Tony Dalton, the author, has a way of writing that sweeps you along Fisher's story, and I suppose it's theoretically possible that one day an even more in-depth book will come out about Fisher, but I seriously doubt it. I would say this has got to be the definitive history of Fisher, which importantly is told from a long-term friend of Fisher and his family. And so to think you're reading a book that has been fully authorized by Fisher's family, it means that, well, firstly, it doesn't mean that it's been censored or curated, so it's like shallow. No, instead it's like frank and full of his explanation of his career and his character. But also what I just liked is that knowing that people who knew Fisher and his friends and his family had verified the information along the way, I could say, yeah, this is definitive, this is what was true. And the book is not the sole product of Tony Dalton either, in that he had various researchers, including Gavin Badley, who I mentioned earlier with his werewolf book. Badley edited the book, and for something of this size, that's quite an undertaking, but the final product really is first rate. It's also, hallelujah, got an index, so you can dive into the back and explore the background of the particular films and actors and directors, which is always important. So yes, if you're interested in Terence Fisher, Hammer horror, or Gothic cinema in general, I thoroughly recommend this book. But even if you're not that familiar with Fisher himself, I still think this is a pretty remarkable book, which I think is rather fitting for such a remarkable man. Terence Fisher, Master of Gothic Cinema, is out now from FAB Press. Well, listen, thank you for listening. If you want to hear more from me, then visit peterlaws.co.uk, where you can find out more about my books and novels and music, but also my two free podcasts, Creepy Cove, Community Church, and Frightful. And if you want even more members-only content, including a private weekly podcast from me, then check out my Patreon at patreon.com/creepycove, where you find all sorts of weird horror stuff. But for now, thank you for watching, and I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.